In this video, we'll learn how to add and subtract complex numbers. So let's look closer at number 4. This is a complex number made of real number -7 and imaginary number 2i. This is another complex number made up of real number 5 and imaginary number 11i. Now, every time we have a plus between the two complex numbers, we don't really need the parentheses. So we can start step number 1, which is drop the parentheses. So let's do that. Now the next step is to combine like terms. Think of I as an x. So I have -7 and 5. These are two real numbers. So -7 plus 5, that's a -2. Now 2i and 11i, or -11i, are two imaginary numbers. You can think of it as x. So 2x minus 11x. So that would be a minus 9x. Okay, so think of I as an x, and there you go. I just added the two complex numbers. So when we add two complex numbers, we ended up with a complex number -2 minus 9i. Now let's move on to number 5. Since I have addition between these two numbers, then I can just drop the parentheses and I can combine like terms. I have an I have an 8 and an 8, so that's a 16. So I combine those two. And -11i, that's a -22i, so I can just add the two imaginary numbers, -11 and -11, that's -22i. So I ended up with another complex number. So let's move on. Let's try to add these two complex numbers. Since I have addition between them, I can just drop the parentheses and combine like terms. So 16 minus 8, that's an 8. 17i and -12i, so 17 minus 12, that's a 5. And don't forget to add the I. So that's it. This is how we add complex numbers. So if you add two complex numbers, what will you end up with? You will end up with a complex number, which is basically A plus BI, where A is real and BI is imaginary. Now let's move on to subtracting complex numbers. Now since I have a minus and minus changes sign, what I need to do first is to distribute the negative to the second parentheses. So let me drop the parentheses for the first number and distribute the negative. So the negative will change the sign, so this becomes a -8, and -11i will become 11i. Now after I do that, let's combine like terms. 8 and -8, that's a 0. -11i and plus 11i, that's a 0 as well, so I ended up with a 0. Because basically I'm subtracting a number from itself, and that's why I ended up with a 0. Now let's move on to the next example. Since I have a minus and minus changes sign, so I need to change the sign of 9 plus 10i. They become -9 and -10i. Drop the parentheses for the first one and combine like terms. So 17 minus 9, that's an 8. -6 and -10, that's -16. Don't forget the I. And there you go, that's a complex number again. So when you subtract two complex number, you will end up with a complex number, unless you are subtracting a number from itself. Of course, you're going to end up with a 0, because 2 minus 2 is a 0. Let's move on to number 9. Since I have a negative between the parentheses, I will distribute the negative. And I will just copy the first one down. Combine like terms. 18 minus 2, that's a 16. -27 minus 3, that's a -30i. And that's another complex number. So when you subtract two numbers, what will you end up with? You will end up with a complex number, unless you are subtracting a number from itself, of course. So that's how you add and that's how you subtract complex numbers. Now, a common mistake that a lot of students do is that the moment they see parentheses, they think they need to FOIL. So they start FOILing -7 times 5 and -7 times 11i. Now, that is incorrect because we have an addition between them. So we're actually adding and not multiplying. So you just drop the parentheses and combine like terms. The same thing with the negative, with the subtraction. Again, students see parentheses and think that they need to FOIL. But remember, when you have a minus, you have first of all to distribute the negative, and then you just add and combine like terms. So that's it for this video, and let's move on to our third video, which is multiplying complex numbers.